The fire took only 13 minutes to erase everything I had spent my adult life building. My small, quiet home at the corner of Pine Ridge had stood there for 23 years, long enough to feel like a part of me, but when the flames finished their work, nothing remained except charcoal, twisted steel, and the bitter smell of burned dreams. For days after, neighbors stopped by with sympathetic frowns and carefully chosen words, offering condolences for something no one could truly comfort. And hovering behind them all, always watching, always calculating, was the Pine Ridge HOA. They didn't offer condolences. They didn't offer help. They didn't even offer a moment of silence for the ruin. Instead, they stood at the edge of the property like vultures on a wire, waiting for a reason, any reason, to swoop down. The president, known by everyone simply as Margaret, visited the very next morning after the fire. She didn't ask if I needed a place to stay. She didn't ask if I was all right. She simply informed me, in a rehearsed tone, that the HOA would be reviewing the status of the lot now that the structure was gone. That was the first moment I felt the shift. A cold prickle along the spine. A warning. Something was coming. In the weeks that followed, while I sifted through the ash looking for photographs and unburned scraps of my past, I watched HOA members stroll across my ruined property as if it already belonged to them. They measured. They pointed. They whispered to each other with narrowed eyes and clipboards tucked against their chests, pretending not to see me as I stood there in my soot-covered clothes. They treated the place not like it was the remains of a life, but like it was an empty parcel ready for development. The letter arrived 10 days after the fire. It came certified, stamped, and heavy with the kind of language that always means trouble. According to the HOA's post-incident assessment, my lot had reverted to common property because the primary structure defining ownership boundaries no longer existed. They claimed that without the house, my land automatically fell into their control. They told me I had 30 days to clear the debris or the HOA would take appropriate action to remove it, and charge me for the cost. Something inside me that had been numb since the fire suddenly reignited. My family had purchased this land decades before the HOA even existed. I knew that. I remembered the old green folder in my father's office, the one containing the original deed with signatures that looked like art. But when I went to retrieve it, the fire had claimed it too. Every document I owned, every paper trail that led back to the origins of the land, was now ash crumbling between my fingers. Without proof, I had nothing, at least on the surface. The HOA assumed I would panic. They assumed I would accept their claim because I was exhausted, displaced, and grieving the loss of my home. They assumed wrong. The moment they tried to take what little remained of my life, something hardened inside me. A determination. A resolve. A voice telling me that even if everything I owned was gone, the truth wasn't. The land had belonged to my family long before the HOA existed. That meant a record had to still exist, somewhere. And I would find it. I started my investigation the way most desperate people do, in the dusty, quiet corners of old county files. I visited the records office so many times that the clerk began greeting me by name. I combed through microfilm reels, scanned yellowed maps drawn long before the subdivision had a name, and dug into every archived plat, survey, and zoning document I could locate. For the first few days, the search felt hopeless. Every document I pulled up seemed to confirm the modern borders of the HOA, not the older divisions from before it was formed, but I kept going. Eventually, after hours of flipping through brittle pages in a back storage room that smelled like mildew and forgotten history, I found something, a survey map from 44 years ago, labeled Pine Ridge Farm Subdivision, Phase 0. It was drawn before the HOA. Before the modern development. Before the neighborhood had paved streets or matching mailboxes. And on that map, outlined in faded black ink, was my family's lot, clearly marked as a privately held parcel, not community property. The problem? It wasn't enough. A map proved boundaries, not ownership. I needed a deed. A transfer. A sale record. Anything. And so the search continued. I expanded my investigation to local archives, even digging into newspaper clippings from the era. Every scrap of information painted the same picture: the land had been purchased by my father long before the HOA bought up the surrounding plots. The only missing piece was the final legal proof. Then something unexpected happened. While browsing old property tax ledgers, I noticed a pattern. For years, decades even, the county had taxed my family directly for that specific parcel. Not the HOA. Not the community. Not any organization claiming ownership. Only us. And if the county had been taxing us individually, that meant the county recognized the land as ours. Still, the HOA pushed forward. They scheduled a special meeting to discuss the acquisition and repurposing of the burned lot for community benefit. They circulated whispers that the land would be turned into a communal garden or playground. They acted as if the decision was already made. Margaret strutted around the neighborhood with renewed confidence, telling homeowners that legal matters were in progress and that everything was falling into place. She had no idea what I was uncovering. But as I collected evidence and pieced together the truth, I began to realize the HOA wasn't just mistaken, they were hiding something. Some of their claims didn't match the public records. Some of their older documents were mysteriously missing. And every time I requested a specific set of HOA files, I was told they were misplaced, under review, or no longer available. Their behavior wasn't simply aggressive. It was suspicious. And suspicious behavior usually meant there was something they desperately didn't want me to find. By the end of the month, my investigation had turned into a full-time mission. I woke early, studied documents, made timelines, and traced ownership history from the subdivision's creation to the present day. I interviewed former board members, tracked down elderly residents who remembered the land before the HOA even existed, and slowly constructed a timeline that exposed a massive discrepancy between the HOA's claims and the historical record. Piece by piece, a hidden truth was forming. A truth the HOA had relied on no one ever discovering. A truth that would change everything once I uncovered the final missing link. And that link revealed itself in the most unexpected place, an obscure records archive miles outside the county. It was the kind of building most people drove past without noticing, a squat stone structure with no windows, a flickering light, and a sign that simply read Regional Storage Annex. If I hadn't followed a trail of old file references, I would never have found it. Inside, buried at the bottom of a metal drawer, was an aging envelope containing a document so important, so defining, that I knew instantly why the HOA had fought so hard to keep me from finding it. It was the original ownership record of my land. And it contradicted everything the HOA claimed. As I held the document in my trembling hands, a realization settled over me, quiet at first, but growing with each passing second. The HOA didn't just want my land. They feared what the truth would reveal about how the community was built in the first place. And now I had the first real piece of proof. The envelope containing the original ownership record felt heavier than paper should. It was soft around the edges, worn from decades of storage, but the seal had remained intact, untouched by anyone who might have tried to make it disappear. The moment I opened it, the smell of old ink and dust carried a strange finality, as though the past itself had been waiting for someone, anyone, to lift the lid off what the HOA wanted forgotten. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed and delicate, but still perfectly legible. My father's signature was there, unmistakable. The date was decades earlier than the HOA's founding. And stamped across the bottom was the line that mattered most: privately owned parcel. Not subject to community incorporation. That sentence made everything clear. Not only did the land belong to my family long before the HOA existed, but it had also been legally excluded from HOA control during the community's formation. It was not part of the association's authority. And yet, for years, they had acted as if they owned rights to it, charging fines, sending notices, and enforcing rules that were never meant to apply. The HOA had overstepped for decades. And now that I had the truth in my hands, the panic inside the HOA began to show. When I returned home from the storage annex, I found 2 members of the board standing at the edge of my burned lot again. Their posture was stiffer than before, their clipboards held tighter, their voices low but tense. They watched me approach with the same suspicion I had seen all month, but this time something else flickered in their eyes: uncertainty. They didn't know what I had found. Not yet. But they sensed the shift. Over the next several days, I continued my investigation with a new purpose. What had started as a desperate search to save my property evolved into something much larger. This wasn't just about me anymore. The HOA had overreached far beyond my situation, manipulating documents, twisting rules, and enforcing regulations that didn't align with the original design of the community. I began mapping the entire neighborhood's history. Old files revealed inconsistencies, tiny at first, then glaring once connected. Certain parcels were drawn differently on older maps than on newer ones, as if someone had casually redrawn borders to suit a purpose. Some homes were listed under special designations, exempt from certain HOA rules without residents even knowing why. Several properties had irregular boundary lines on early plats that no longer matched the HOA's published maps. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA had quietly shifted the community borders at some point, absorbing land that didn't belong to them and redrawing boundaries to increase their authority. The burned lot wasn't the first. It was just the one they assumed would be easiest to claim because a fire had wiped away the structure. But the structure didn't define ownership. The land did. And the land was never theirs. News of my research began trickling through the neighborhood. Homeowners started knocking on my temporary rental door, curious why the HOA seemed unusually tense. Some described years of unexplained fines, rule changes, and quiet maneuvering that didn't seem to follow any official process. One couple mentioned losing a strip of their yard due to a boundary correction years earlier, something they had never questioned because the HOA insisted it was routine maintenance. The more people talked, the more the HOA scrambled to maintain control. Margaret, armed with her familiar self-importance, announced an emergency HOA meeting to discuss recent misinformation being spread by disgruntled residents. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she meant. Her voice carried the brittle edge of someone who felt power slipping through their fingers. But the meeting didn't go how she planned. Before she could even finish her prepared statement, homeowners began asking questions, real questions. Why were older records missing? Why had property lines changed? Why were archived HOA maps different from county maps? Why had they attempted to seize my burned property without verifying ownership? Margaret's responses were polished but shaky. She insisted everything was done legally, that documents were lost during administrative transitions, that the HOA acted in the community's best interest. But the crowd wasn't convinced. For the first time, the neighborhood saw the cracks in the facade of control the HOA had held for years. Still, something was missing. I had found the ownership record, maps, tax ledgers, and testimonies from residents. But the one thing I still didn't have was the smoking gun, the proof of when and how the HOA had shifted the borders. The actual act. The catalyst. The moment they went from managing the neighborhood to quietly seizing it piece by piece. That piece would make everything undeniable. I searched deeper into the archives, following any possible lead that could reveal how the border changes happened. It wasn't until I revisited an old zoning binder from the early development era, something I had skimmed before without noticing, that I found a section titled, Provisional Amendments, Proposed, Not Enforced. It listed several adjustments the community planners had suggested but never finalized. Among them was an entry that made my pulse quicken: potential incorporation expansion, phase-adjusted maps pending legal approval. Next to it was the notation, rejected. Insufficient jurisdiction. Rejected. Not approved. Never authorized. Yet, the HOA had used the expanded borders from that rejected amendment as if they were valid. That was the missing link. The borders had been changed illegally. Not by law. Not by vote. Not by oversight. By the HOA itself. With this new revelation, everything finally aligned. The HOA had built its authority on a foundation of altered maps and assumptions, hoping no one would dig back far enough to see the truth. And they had nearly succeeded, until the fire forced everything into the open. The moment I gathered all the documents together, original deed, early maps, rejected amendments, tax records, and testimonies, I realized I now possessed enough evidence to dismantle the HOA's entire claim not just on my property, but potentially on multiple parcels within the community. And the HOA knew it. 2 days after I completed my timeline, a letter appeared on my doorstep. Unlike the cold, formal notices they typically sent, this one was short and urgent, requesting a private discussion regarding the future of the burned lot. It was signed by Margaret herself. They weren't trying to assert ownership anymore. They were trying to negotiate. That meant one thing. They were scared. And fear meant weakness, weakness I could use to finally expose everything they had done. But before I could respond, something happened that made the situation much darker, revealing the lengths the HOA was willing to go to protect their secret. The day after Margaret's urgent letter arrived, the first sign of danger appeared, not through confrontation, but through silence. For weeks, the HOA had patrolled my burned lot daily, hovering like anxious guards protecting a secret. But now, the familiar presence of clipboards and suspicious glances had vanished. Not a single board member walked near the property. No one measured boundaries. No one muttered about debris removal. It was as if the HOA had suddenly decided the land no longer existed. And silence rarely meant surrender. It usually meant strategy. That morning, as I stepped outside the rental home where I'd been staying, I noticed a small envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my truck. No stamp. No return address. No signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in bold. Stop digging. You don't know what you're uncovering. The words were short, yet heavy with warning. Not the kind sent by someone wanting to resolve a problem, but by someone desperate to keep one hidden. Instead of fear, the note only fueled my determination. If the HOA had resorted to anonymous threats, then I was very close to revealing something they never wanted exposed. And whatever that was, it didn't just involve my land, it involved the entire foundation of Pine Ridge. I returned to my collection of documents, spreading them across the long kitchen table. The pieces now formed a clear story. My land was privately owned and excluded from HOA incorporation. The community borders had been illegally expanded using a rejected amendment. The HOA had operated with authority it never legitimately had. But there was still a missing component, the signature. Somewhere, someone had authorized the false borders. Someone had slipped the unauthorized map into HOA circulation. Someone had initiated the deception. I needed that person. I dug deeper into old HOA rosters, tracking every board member from the year the borders changed. Most were retired or had moved away. But one name kept appearing, someone who had served during the boundary expansion attempt, then resigned abruptly. Raymond Keller. No one had heard from him in years. With a little effort, I tracked him down to a quiet mobile home park outside the county. When I arrived, he seemed cautious but curious, a man carrying the weight of old decisions. Though I wasn't allowed to write dialogue, his body language conveyed enough, hesitation at first, then a slow unraveling of guilt as I explained everything. He didn't need to speak to confirm the truth. It was dusty and brittle with age, but the label on the front stopped me cold. Pine Ridge, rejected amendments, pre-incorporation documents, and altered proposals. Inside were the original notes from the development meetings, early sketches, unofficial drafts, and internal memos that never made it into public archives. But one page stood out, the page that ended everything. A memo from the founding HOA president instructing the board to adopt the expanded map quietly even though the county had formally rejected the incorporation. It was the smoking gun. The border shift wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't sloppy record-keeping. It was intentional. And illegal. With that memo, everything fell into place. The HOA had knowingly operated on falsified borders, collecting fees, issuing fines, enforcing rules, and trying to seize land that never belonged to them. They had built a kingdom on sand and hoped no one would ever dig deep enough to feel the ground give way. But now the ground had already cracked. When I returned home with the memo, the HOA sensed the change. There was no more posturing. No more demands. No more accusations. Instead, the board called for a mandatory emergency vote, inviting every homeowner to attend. It wasn't an act of authority, it was an act of fear. The meeting hall was packed. Homeowners filled the chairs, lined the walls, and stood in the aisles. The air was thick with curiosity, anticipation, and the quiet rumble of people finally demanding answers. And there, at the front of the room, Margaret sat rigid, clutching her binder like a shield she knew could no longer protect her. When I placed the old memo on the table, the room shifted. People leaned forward. Papers rustled. Confusion turned to shock. Shock turned to anger. And anger, slowly but powerfully, transformed into a collective realization. The HOA had no legal authority over multiple properties, and maybe not over the community at all. Homeowners murmured, their frustration rising like a tide. Faces reddened. Plans for a community takeover of my burned lot suddenly looked like a reckless overreach rather than leadership. Every fine issued, every property dispute, every forced compliance, all of it was now under question. And as the tension spread through the room, the board members finally understood that the era of their unquestioned rule had ended. Once the documents were reviewed in full, the verdict became inevitable. The homeowners called for a vote, one that would decide the HOA's future. What followed wasn't chaos. It wasn't loud. It was controlled, calm, and firm. A community choosing truth over manipulation. By the end of the night, Pine Ridge HOA was dissolved. Months later, after legal review and county intervention, my property was officially reaffirmed as mine, fully, indisputably, and permanently. I rebuilt the home I had lost, not as a symbol of victory, but as proof that even in ashes, truth survives. The HOA had tried to take the last piece of my life. But in the end, it was their empire that burned.